All right. Well, welcome everybody. We have a good crowd here, so that's cool. This is part 2. We're looking at compliance versus good IEPs because compliant doesn't always mean good. So this is part 2. So we'll start with introductions as we always do. We're going to go through sections 4 through 8. We got through academic goals last time, so we're going to start with functional gaps and goals this time. Questions, feel free to put questions in the chat box. Ashley is standing by. She put links to this PowerPoint in the chat box, and those PDFs do have live links in them. All right, so let's go. This is our team. We are the Supervision, Monitoring, and Support team. We like the support part of our job better than the supervision and monitoring part. So I am Jennifer Gleason. I was a special education teacher and an ed tech, not in that order, before I joined this team almost 4 years ago now. And with us, we have Carly.
Hi, everyone. I am Carly Thibodeau, and I have been on this team for 2.5 years. And before that, I was a teacher for 21 years.
And we have Ashley.
Hi, everybody. My name's Ashley Satry, and I have been on this team for about 1.5 years. And before that, I too was a special ed teacher for 14 years.
So now you know why we all like the support job part of our job better, because we're all teachers. We also have with us today our super wrangler, Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Pelletier. I am the admin support for the monitoring team. I'm just starting my 8th year with Maine DOE, and prior to that, I was admin support to a K-5 elementary school for 16 years.
Thanks, Julie.
You're welcome, Jennifer.
We wouldn't know where we were from moment to moment without Julie. She takes very good care of us. All right, so we're going to start with kind of a reiteration of what we talked about in part 1 of why we're here. So our job, one of our jobs, our main job as a team is to make sure that everybody is following IDEA, following those regulations in that statute, right? Because we get a little bit of money for special education, but in return, we have to follow the regulations. So that is our job, to make sure everybody's doing that so we can get our money. But more fun than that is doing this kind of thing, professional development. So for the past couple years, because we are a relatively new team, we've been really asking ourselves and each other and anybody who will listen, why are we looking at this? Why are we doing this? Why do we require this? And for some things, we didn't get an answer. So we dug into IDEA. We met with our national technical assistance providers, and we found out we were looking way too deep. We were really looking for best practice and calling it compliance. So we changed how we're reviewing files with this current 24-25 cohort, but we are still training best practice because a compliant IEP isn't necessarily a good IEP. I want to skip this slide, Carly. Sorry, I think it's redundant. So an example, an example of compliance versus best practice is you're at an IEP meeting and the parent waives their right to 7-day notice so that the IEP can start right away. You document the parent waived their right to 7-day notice in the written notice. Completely compliant, 100%. best practice would be you would have them sign the optional 7-day waiver form. So that's the kind of thing we are looking at. Part 1 will be on our professional learning page shortly. We have to go through other people in the department to get it out there, but it'll be there shortly. So if you missed that, not to worry. This is our IEP quick reference document. And this really lays out the difference between what's compliant and what's best practice, and it's color coded and it's super cool. I don't know if this page has a link, but there's definitely a link to it at the end of the presentation.
The title at the top is the link.
Is the link. Thank you, Carly. Of course it is.
And it looks like Ashley just dropped it.
Perfect. You guys are awesome. All right, so this is just a really handy document to have. All right, so let's get into functional. This is functional gaps. And this is a clip from that document we just looked at. So you want your functional, we're talking about functional and developmental. You want your distinctly measurable and persistent skill gaps. We highly recommend a bulleted list. We love a bulleted list. Anywhere you can bullet things instead of writing a narrative, do it. Takes everybody less time, easier to read. You really want to focus on specific skills rather than broad areas, and we'll talk about that. You need to have your how statement. Don't forget that. And for every gap listed here, you need to have a goal to address it. So this is what we're talking about when we say really specific gaps. You don't want to put a gap in fine motor because that involves a lot of different things, right? You want to have really specific gaps. Is it coloring? Is it cutting? Is it handwriting? Those are your specific skill gaps. You want to get really specific. Like adaptive, sorry, Carly. Adaptive, you could see toileting, hand washing, cooking, eating. Sometimes we see those all wrapped up in one goal. Those are very, very different skills. Thanks, Carly. These are examples of how statements. So for your specific skill gaps, we want to know how those affect the child's ability to access and progress in the gen ed curriculum. And we have a few examples here. And here's an example of what it could look like. Here we have 2 gaps. They're bulleted. We have a how statement for each of these gaps. You don't necessarily have to do that. You can do whatever makes sense for the situation. You could have one how statement that encompasses all the gaps. You could have one for each gap. You could chunk them in a way that makes sense. Each IEP is going to be different. Alignment, if you've been in any of our trainings, you know we talk about alignment a lot. So each gap needs to be addressed with a goal, right? You don't want to have a gap and then say, hey, this student has a gap, but we're not going to do anything with it, right? So each gap must have a goal. So here is our example. We have a gap in handwriting, and we have a goal that says Jack will complete writing tasks with no letter reversals and correct placement of letters on the line. We have responding to questions, and Jack will appropriately respond to verbal and written questions with 80% accuracy. So you can see they're really specific skill gaps and measurable. And we have baseline data in our present level of performance, which is the same data point as the goal, right? Your baseline data and your measurement data. What am I? Oh, this is the goal. This is, sorry. This is section 5. So we just looked at the gaps. So now we're looking at the goals. Again, present level, this is your baseline data for this goal. You want really I mean, it's your baseline data. You don't want a range necessarily. You don't want it to be subjective. Sometimes, often seems to. It's your baseline data. If you don't have data, you know you want a student to work on a thing and you don't have baseline data, if you could do a quick probe, that's your baseline data. In this moment, bam, this is where they are, and that will help you kind of figure out where you want to go with it. If you don't have the baseline data, it's kind of hard to know where you want them to be. So your goals must be measurable, must have measurement data, cannot be specific curriculum or standard scores. Best practice, again, we want to focus on those really specific skill deficits and use specific measurements. You don't want to use the curriculum. You want to pull the data out of those curriculum assessments. Like if you are working on fluency, you're going to pull out words correct per minute, right? With whatever text, whatever grade level text. Rather than say, F&P level L or something like that. You don't want to do that. And again, alignment, here we want every goal needs to be aligned to a service, right? And if you think about it, you don't expect the student to achieve the goal by themselves. You need to have a service to help them achieve that goal. So here's an example. We have baseline data in present level. Jack can complete writing tasks with no letter reversals and correct placement in 1 out of 5 opportunities. And we want him to do that exact thing in 4 out of 5 opportunities. So you can see the alignment between the baseline data and the goal. And you can see it's really a clear data point. So often with functional goals, we see what we refer to as outcomes instead of skills. So these kind of tend to align to those broad areas that we had talked about. And often those broad areas could be your house statement in a way. So we have an example, I think. Yep. So receptive or expressive language, you don't want, there are so many skills involved in those things. You're not just going to write a goal and, receptive language, because what is that? It could be many things. So here we have articulation, answering WH questions, vocab. These are your specific skills that contribute to those broad areas of receptive and expressive language. And again, this is the same example, alignment between the gaps and the goals. Here's another example. Oh, this is social work. We get a lot of questions about social work. Social work goals are so hard for a couple reasons. They're hard to measure. Because say a student is working on positive self-talk, hard to measure that, right? So social work goals tend to be hard to measure, and also social workers are not data people, they're feelings people, which I appreciate so much in them. So here are some examples. Identify feelings in self and others, and identify self-regulation strategies. So here's a student just learning about self-regulation strategies. We're not expecting them to access them yet, right? So our first goal, we have a baseline data using photos. Jack identifies the correct feeling in 45% of trials. And our goal is to identify feelings in himself and others in 70%. And here you could see we have some short-term objectives. Functional goals never require short-term objectives. You can always have them, but they're never required. And the goal must stand on its own. You should just, the goal needs to be measurable without the objectives, if that makes sense. When we look at IEPs, we don't even look at the objectives. So the goal must be measurable on its own. And our other example is Jack can identify 3 self-regulation strategies in 0% of opportunities. And we want him to be able to identify 3 different strategies in 55% of opportunities by the end of the year. So just a couple social worker examples. And if we have social workers here who are working on goals and struggling, or anybody really, feel free to send us a hypothetical over email. Please don't send an IEP. But hypothetically, if I were to write this goal, would it be compliant? And we are happy to work that out with you because we're teachers and that's what we like. So again, best practice, 1 skill deficit for 1 goal. And you want to use really specific measurements. You want to pull them out of the assessment so that if the student goes somewhere else and they use a different reading program, they'll be able to understand that data point and use it with their curriculum. They can probably find that data point anywhere. Oh, I already said this. Cool. Short-term objectives are never required for functional goals, but always allowed. They should be short-term, right? Your goal is for a year. Your objectives are less than a year. And just another goal with short-term objectives. And this is an OT goal. Oh, this is the writing one, writing tasks with no letter reversals and correct placement of letters in 4 out of 5 opportunities. And you could see we go from 2 out of 5 to 3 out of 5 to 4 out of 5. So those are those short-term objectives. When I was writing goals, I would make the objectives line up to our progress monitoring schedule because that seemed to make sense. This is an alignment visual because we love visual supports, and you really want to make sure that everything is aligned throughout the IEP, right? Your gaps, each gap has a present level and a goal to address it, and there is a service to help the child achieve that goal. So this is the alignment between the goal and the service. So we have an occupational goal and a speech language goal, and they're both there in the service grid. You can have 2 different providers working on a goal together. Self-regulation is a common one. You might have with given specially designed instruction and OT consult, blah, 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 blah. That is absolutely fine, but make sure both are in the service grid. All right, questions before we move on to section 6. Oh, we have one here. When you're measuring and identifying 3 strategies, what if the second reporting period is only identifies 2? Would you measure that as a 0%? If it's the second reporting period, I wouldn't expect him to have 3 and 55. I guess it depends how you want to report that. I don't know if you write narratives for your progress reports or just give a number. I mean, you could call it 2/3 of the way there, right? I guess that's up to you is really my answer. I'm sorry for the non-answer. Any other questions? I mean, Carly, you have a better answer than that for me for this question?
Not at all. I was just going to say back up at the beginning, kind of Lena had asked about highlighting how we change the auditing compliance process. And so this is kind of it. This is like this whole compliance versus best practice. That's been the big shift from the last time you were in through the process. And so the IEP quick reference document, I think, is your best guide to help you figure out like what has changed and what pieces we'll be looking at for compliance versus best practice. But if you have quite like more specific questions than that, we're happy to go through that with you. And like Jennifer said, depending on when we end, we can always stay on and talk about that. Okay. Awesome.
All right.
In terms of this presentation, Jennifer, are you going to talk a little bit, because I know at one of the last presentations you did with functional goals, the importance of it being skill-based versus outcome-based?
Yeah, we just hit on that a very little bit. There is a recording on our website that is a short training that focuses just on that.
Do you know the title of it?
I will look it up right now and put the link in the chat box because I'm turning it over to Carly.
I'll
Yes,
grab
I
it.
think it's measurable goals, something.
Something.
So, yeah.
I'll look it up.
Yeah. Okay.
right.
So we're going to move on to the next section. If questions come up again, just feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want, you can come off of mute. We're a pretty big group, so chat might be easier just for time's sake, but whatever you want to do. Whoopsies. Okay, so this is section 6, just moving along in the IEP. This is a snapshot from that IEP quick reference document that outlines the compliance pieces for this section where you're doing your supplementary aid services, modifications, and/or supports. So there are certain pieces that we expect to see here for compliance, such as those supports and tools included for students to be successful in the gen ed and special ed setting. All the boxes must be filled across the row. And then this would be the spot where you would include ed techs, BHPs, assistants that are working with the student because they are not to be on the service grid. If you want to identify the people besides the certified special ed teacher or licensed related service provider, they would go here, not the service grid. So here's an example of some things that may go in section 6, because this is very individual to the student, as the whole IEP is, but this is just one example. When we look at section 3 to see if those yes, no's are checked off, and if something is checked yes, many times it could be appropriate for it to be documented in section 6. For example, 3B asks about if there are positive behavioral interventions and supports for the student. So it may be appropriate that it is in section 6. It could be a positive behavior support plan. It could be other things. It doesn't always have to be a behavior plan necessarily. And then just another example we give is that 3C, if you have those multilingual learners, then if they are receiving those services from like your ESOL department, then that ILAP should be documented here, that individual language acquisition plan. So just keep those in mind. And then also if you're teaching supports and you have them listed within a goal, a lot of times it's in that given statement where you say given specially designed instruction and, you know, such like the fidgets, the wobble stool, etc., the things that you're putting into the goal, those should be also included in that, on that accommodations page, to make sure that they're available for the student. And then again, just remembering that you want to make sure there are no blank boxes. So if you fill something out in the left-hand column, making sure that the row is completed all the way across. I'll say that the thing that I see the most often is the check boxes of like kind of when or where they're able to use them, like classroom, district-wide assessment, state assessment, that sort of thing. So just making sure you're filling it out across the row. Then, as I talked about a little bit before, if you have other staff members working with a student and you want to document that, this is the section where you would want to document that. And this is an example of sometimes we see consult on the service grid, but there's no goal aligned to it. And so people are like, sometimes people will tell us, well, we're not really working on a goal. I'm just checking in with the teacher to make sure that the student is doing all right, you know, since they're no longer receiving like direct service, they're just on a consult. Well, if you're not working on a goal, then it should not be on the service grid. So this would be the place to do those teacher to teacher check-ins if you want to document those. So we have an example of a regular ed teacher and an OT with a collaboration, so they can talk about those accommodations needed for a student, but there's not necessarily a goal that the OT is working on, and so they wouldn't be on the service grid. This would be an appropriate place to document that. And same with those educational technicians, BHPs, or any of those related service assistants. You can put them on in this section. They should not be listed in section 7.
Carly, I'm going to pause you there just for a second because Jennifer just asked that exact question about the SLPA. So that answers your question there, Jennifer, I think, about documenting an SLPA. So this is where they would go.
Yes.
Yep. And then there's one more about a goal for fidgets, wobble stools, that kind of stuff. I'll let you answer, Carly, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, no, you do not have to include those things in the goal. They can be an accommodation all by themselves. However, that goal did include them. So if you are putting them in the goal, then they should be in the accommodation section. But they can just be in the accommodation section by themselves without being in a goal. Welcome. The other part of section 6 is 6B, where you look at the alternate assessment and determine whether the student is going to take the alternate assessment. And so this is that snapshot from the IEP quick reference document. So for compliance, if this is checked yes, then there must be an explanation included. And then they also need to have objectives with their academic goals. So here's an example of a student that is going to take the alternate assessment. So it's checked yes, and then there is an explanation here. So that's compliant. Best practice would be if they're not taking the alternate assessment, one of these boxes should still be checked. So either no or NA. And it doesn't matter which one you choose, no or NA. We've had that question before, like whether we question whether the student should take the alternate or not. If one of the boxes is checked, that's really just best. And if you want more information about the alternate assessment, this is a link that will take you to that information. And this is that participation decision flow chart that should be used by the team to help make that decision of whether the student would take the alternate assessment. And then 6, this is also just a link to those standards. They're called the alternate academic achievement standards. However, they're called core content connectors. They really have 2 names, which is very confusing to me. And just a little, I don't know if it's been fixed. We are having a huge problem on Maine DOE websites where links are dead. And last time we've been in here, the core content connectors links are not working. So we are aware of that, and we have, in the assessment team is aware of that also. So hopefully those are back up and going. But if you need them for any reason and you can't get to them and you don't have access to them, please reach out. We're hopefully getting a hard copy of those. We've been in touch with the assessment team, like I said. And then here's an example of if, yes, they're taking the alternate assessment, the student needs to have at least one objective with their academic goals. And it's only the academic goals that require objectives when it comes to the alternate assessment. And remember, it's that short-term objective. So really it's that goal, and then it's just broken down over time. And then I just included a few more links that will take you to some useful tools that are related to section 6. around accommodations on the Maine through year, information about multilingual learners, and then more information about that MSAA, the alternate assessment. So if the SLPA is providing services under the SLP, can you clarify what that might say as an accommodation for an ed tech? We might just say, okay. So the SLP would go on the service grid because they're the position responsible. The SLPA may be providing services, and if you choose to include them on the accommodations page to inform the parent that the SLPA is working with them, you can. It is not necessary that they're on the accommodations page, but some people want to make sure that it's very clear that that assistant is working with the student. So you would list it as you would list any other accommodation, whether you want to give them a specific time or a more specific frequency like you would on the service grid, but it's still filled out the same like location frequency. So you can be as specific as you want to be with that assistant working with the student. For an ed tech, we might just say ed tech support in the classroom setting, but for an SLPA or CODA, they are actually providing services. Right, so it's the same thing because ed techs also provide services, sometimes in place or in conjunction with the special ed teacher. So I know when I was a special ed teacher, I had ed techs that would run groups for me. And so if I were to put them on that accommodation page, I would probably just put as needed because they would take care of the groups that they needed to take care of. On the service grid, it identifies what they're receiving for services and what we're overseeing and making sure they're getting. And then those ed techs would be available, or those assistants would be available to provide those services as necessary. Team members, do you have thoughts on that? No. Okay. Okay, so speaking of that, we're going to get into section 7. And so this is another snapshot from the quick reference document. So you can see the compliance versus best practice when it comes to the service grid. And so again, this is very similar to section 6. It's really whatever you fill in here just needs to be completed completely across the row. And really it should be about the student's needs and not the school schedule. And then just making sure you're filling in all of those boxes completely. Best practice here is that if you have a service here, then it would align back to a goal. So I kind of touched on that when I talked about sometimes we see consult without a goal because people are saying, well, I'm just checking in and, you know, that sort of thing. So we're not working on a goal. So just think about if you're putting a service here, it really should have a goal aligned to it. And then SVC4 is a new one that we are looking at starting this cohort, where when we look at a service grid, we have to verify that the students are receiving those services on the service grid. So this year, this cohort, we've been asking for provider schedules, including special ed teachers for SDI, but also speech and language, OT, PT, any of those related services that would be on IEPs. So that we can check that the services are on the IEP and that the provider, that they're getting those services. But we can talk about that a little more. I think I have a slide in here about that. So these are the things that we look at. So here's just an example around the services really being about what the child needs and not around the school or program schedule. We know that this is more common in middle and high school when you have block scheduling and it gets really tricky. We understand that this is like it's not really a special ed thing. It's more of a school schedule thing. But just to kind of keep this in mind. So if you have a schedule where you have a student that has study hall from 9 to 10, and then they would have special ed study hall at the same time from 9 to 10. They may be getting their specially designed instruction and reading during that 9 to 10 block. However, they only need 30 minutes per week. So this is an hour per day, per every other day, whatever it is. So they should not be on their service grid. It shouldn't reflect the block of time for the study hall. it should reflect what the student needs to meet the goals for that specially designed instruction in reading. And so if they leave their study hall, they go do their SDI in reading, and then they are told they can't go back to their study hall, then that would be giving them too many services, like it would be over their time. And so, but you could have an accommodation that would allow them to stay if they choose to stay, and that would kind of cover you if they wanted to stay. But if they're like, no, I want to go back to my gen ed study hall, then they should be allowed to go back. Another thing about Section 7 is that you do not want to include content areas such as social studies, science, those sorts of things, because your goals are around the reading, writing, math, speaking and listening, right? Those are those broad areas. So science and social studies, you would not have goals around those, and you would not have services. If they have special education classes in science and social studies, we understand that, but it's probably around that reading deficit that they have, or the writing deficit that they have. So it would be around one of those other skill deficits that they have, not in that content area itself. And then when filling out Section 7, you must fill in each of the columns. Like I said, if you start something on the left-hand side, it goes all the way across. So that position responsible must be that certified special educator or the licensed related service provider. Then you need to fill in your location, your frequency, and then those dates. And just remember to adjust those ESY dates so that it's only during your ESY, because if you do it for the duration of the IEP, you technically could be asked to provide services during February break or April break or over the longer December break. Also remember that speech and language can be either a special ed service or a related service. And we see this, I don't know, I say we see this a little bit, enough to mention it, that the only time that speech and language would be on the top half as a special ed service is when a student is identified with a speech and language impairment, either by itself or part of a multiple, or if the child is identified with autism and speech and language is the only service that they get. All of the other times, it's a related service. So it should be on the bottom half of the service grid. Here's another just kind of reminder about that consultation piece. So when you are writing your goals, in that given statement, if it's a consultation goal, it really should be specified given consultation or given speech and language consultation. It should be very clear that it is a consultation goal, and then we would expect to see alignment in that there's a consultation in the service grid. So if there's a consultation outlined in the service grid, such as here, then there definitely should be a goal. If there is no goal, then you would not put it in the service grid. This could be done in Section 6, like I've talked about a couple of times now. And then here's an example of if you have a service on the service grid, then best practice would be that there is a goal that aligns to it. So you can see here, and this is kind of what Jennifer was talking about earlier, we have two services here, one for specially designed instruction and self-regulation, and one for OT consultation. And this goal identifies both of those services within this one goal because they're both working on this skill in conjunction. So it's given specially designed instruction and consult from an occupational therapist, the student will be able to blah, blah, blah. And so both of those services are aligned to that goal and vice versa. And this is that SVC4 where we're looking for those services being provided according to the IEP. So you can see there's a service grid of an IEP. And so we would look at that, and then we would be looking for either schedules that have been given to us to make sure that the student is listed somewhere to show that they're receiving reading, writing, math, speech, and OT. Or we have come up with this chart down in the left-hand corner that we have available to people. And this is just during when you're up for review. And so we would look at this when we come for our on-site visit. And so we would offer this chart to you to fill out so that you could fill in those services from the IEP, and then you can put who is providing the service and like when they're being seen and how long each session is, so that we can just compare what's on the grid to the service grid. It's been kind of a tricky thing to verify. So if you have another way for us to verify this information, we're all ears. We've just come up with these couple of ways. So we're open to suggestions. Right. Any questions before I jump into section 8? Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat box, so I'm going to keep going, but feel free to interrupt me. Here's that screenshot from section 8. This is that least restrictive environment. And so we look at both the percentage being completed and that LRE statement on the IEP. And this is broken up because there's a CDS portion, and then there's also the K-12. I know people probably don't pay attention to the CDS portion. I know I never did, but now I kind of have to because we visit CDSs, so yes. So when we are looking for that least restrictive environment statement, or looking at that statement, I should say, this is really what we're looking for. The prompt on the IEP is not helpful at all for what we're looking for compliance, because it doesn't state what it is we're looking for. This is from IDEA and Muser. And so basically we're looking for a statement that explains or tells us why the student is not participating with their non-disabled peers in the gen ed setting due to the nature and severity of their disability. So that's the big reason we look for this statement. And then this is just a little visual to talk about what that least restrictive environment is about, right? The least restrictive is that gen ed classroom. And then you can go move all the way up to hospital homebound. And then you have all those pieces in between. So really thinking about when you're looking at all of those components of the IEP, that is what makes up that least restrictive environment for that student. So really thinking about that when you're meeting as a team. And then when you're thinking about the percentage of for that least restrictive environment, because that's the time in the regular classroom, right? That percentage is their time in the regular classroom. So when you're thinking about that, you're thinking about their access to gen ed instruction. So just kind of keep this in the back of your mind when you're thinking about that percentage, because when the student is in the classroom, but they're like pulled off to the side and they're working on something completely different from their peers, then this really is not part of their LRE or their time in the regular classroom, because they're not even participating in the same gen ed curriculum as their peers. However, if they're in the same classroom and they're pulled to the back or the side, or, you know, off doing their own thing, but they're working on something similar to the content that's being worked on in the gen ed classroom, then that would be considered part of their LRE percentage. So really it's about, are they receiving the same access to that gen ed curriculum as their peers when they're in the setting? What if the class is differentiated to learning progression? Oh, never mind. Okay. I think, yeah, I mean, it would be whatever is appropriate. Yeah. And here's an example of a compliant IEP that has a percentage filled out for the student in the LRE. And then the statement, Sammy's other health impairment due to ADHD is to such a degree that he requires individual and small group instruction in the special ed environment. So your LRE statement can be as simple as that. It should not be a restatement of services or the service grid or anything like that, because it's already there in the service grid. You do not need to restate that. Does that LRE work for CDS kids too? The statement, yes. And then you have your percentage is, you would either check off one of those boxes for the gen ed setting or put your total number of hours for the special ed setting. That's what we look for the percentage, is that part is filled out. And then, yes, a very similar statement to this, or this statement.
Can I just ask a quick question on that? So
Yep.
we're asked to put like 3-to-1 ratio, special education program. We're asked to put due to, for example, a moderate delay with communication. Like, we're being instructed based on the new, I think, audit that's coming up for us, that we have to kind of beef up our LRE statements. This seems very like more generic than I think we're being told that we need to put in there. So I don't know. I didn't think that applied to CDS. I thought it was more like school age kids.
I mean, I would have a very similar example for a CDS LRE statement as this one.
Okay.
Team, do you have anything to say about this for CDS LRE statements?
I do. So we often talk about compliance, right? When we come in, we're looking for compliant. If your director wants you to go above and beyond that and do something different, do that.
I think she's passing along guidance that she thinks is being passed on to her. So it may be a conversation for another, sidebar conversation, but and I think because the LRE doesn't print out on the IEP when we put in like specially designed instruction, they're saying, I think it's been passed down to us in the past that we put in the ratio there so that the team members can see, what the ratio is, because that's the only place it would really show up on the IEP, is in the LRE statement.
It's not in section 6 anyway. Sorry, I don't want to get on a tangent.
It doesn't print out on the IEP, just a specially designed instruction.
Oh, okay.
Say the ratio.
If you are in cohort next year, at the beginning of every cohort, we do a training where we go through everything we're going to look at. So that might be helpful.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so those are all the pieces of the IEP. We have a little quiz to do because we know how much you guys love our quizzes at the end of these office hours. So let's get started. So here is an example of a functional present level and goal, and this is non-compliant. Anybody want to put out there why this is non-compliant?
Too general.
Right. Exactly. There's no data. It's not measurable. Right. So instead, really focus on that skill-specific goal and make sure it is measurable. It has to have measurement data within the goal for sure. All right, let's try another one. Okay, this time this is section 7. So why is this non-compliant? Right. Science is a no-no. I'm going to see if anybody caught this one. It's a tricky one, and we didn't really try. Yes, you got it. Dates, exactly. Okay, so right, no science, and the dates, it goes 10:15 to 10:15, and everybody knows you should be one less, so it should be 10:14. So here we just got rid of science because really it was about the reading. So we just focused on the reading, and then the dates are adjusted to 10:14. Yes. All right, we have another one. Why is this non-compliant? This is another service grid one. There's quite a bit going on here. Right. Location, ed tech, yes, yes. There's one other one if anybody can get it. I'll give you a minute to see if you can figure it out. Maybe like 20 seconds. Just kidding. Yeah, the dates, the ESY dates. Exactly. There you go. You got all three. Okay, so here it is fixed up. So we want to make sure we're keeping those special ed teachers or licensed related service providers in there. We want to make sure all those columns are filled in. So location was missing on the last one. And then definitely those ESY dates. Be careful with those. I was super guilty of that. I know when I wrote IEPs because you had to go in and change it because it was automatic. It just filled in. All right, we got one more. This is for LRE. Why is this non-compliant? LRE statements are tricky. You should hear us when we're at on-site visits. We're like, can you read this LRE statement and tell me, like, is this compliant? Like, we test each other all the time. Right. Yes, Lena, I like your blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it is a restatement of services and it doesn't address the nature and severity of the disability. Exactly. You have the language. So here you go. I think this is the exact same one I used in my other example. So it's going to look very familiar. Just really making sure that you're addressing why the student isn't participating and, why they have to be in the special ed setting or receiving their services where they're receiving them. Okay, and we're going to finish up with some resources. If you don't have any other questions, if you do have questions, just interrupt me. I'm okay with that. These links do work if you have it on your computer pulled up as a PDF. This is to the procedural manual, excellent resource, all special ed forms. Maine Unified Special Ed Regulations, or MUSER. This has been updated July of 2024. This is another link to that IEP quick reference document.
That one might be the one that didn't work, Carly. So just use the one from this chat because that link didn't work. But please reach out and we can email it to you too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then these are our other resources. The top one, we do this PD all throughout the school year. So that PD calendar will take you to where you can see all of it and register. The second one is where all those recordings are because every PD we do, we record. And then special ed resources, that's where you can find all those quick reference documents because we have the IEP, we have eligibility forms, and we have the written notice. So lots of resources there. And then, of course, the regulations and other forms. These are the PD trainings that we've done already this school year. And there are some linked to videos and slides that we have up on our website. Some are coming soon. These are the ones that are upcoming. And so you can use these registration links here to register for those if you're interested. Oh, thanks, Ashley. She updated the link for I think that last one on that last slide is not the right one.
Yeah.
And this is our feedback and contact hour form. So please feel free to give us feedback. We really do appreciate it. And we do our best to use it and improve our PD. If you want a contact hour certificate for attending today, just enter your email. You're going to select the training. I think it says 21225 compliant versus good part 2. So that's what you want to select to get the right email with the contact hour certificate. This is where you can find Maine DOE online, social media, all that good stuff. And this is our contact information. We are available to give you feedback or answer questions as they come up. You can reach out to any one of us and we will get back to you. I think Jennifer talked about this earlier when she was presenting. but anytime something comes up, feel free to email us. Just don't send us student information or like in an IEP or a form. Pull it out, copy, paste it, hypothetical. If I were to write this goal, is this compliant? That sort of thing. We are more than happy to get back to you. Any last questions before we let you go for the afternoon?
Lena, if you want to hang on, we're here.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today.